I was born in 1939 at the beginning of World War II. I grew up in my early years with a little town that had plenty of jobs because of the war effort. And although at the beginning the war was very frightening, I was a little too young to know that yet. So when I came into childhood, I began to understand that this war was good, unambiguously good. That's because our enemies were unambiguously bad. So I grew up in a bubble of comfort and optimism. Probably besides my parents, who are very important because we could talk to them about pretty much anything. My most influential people, I think, were my grandmother, who ran a dairy farm about 6 miles away from where we are. Her son, Uncle Bob, was pretty important to me, and so was Aunt Henrietta. Those 3 people at the farm. And why were they? Because I could go out there and run around, and they taught me not to be afraid of guinea hens and not to be afraid of big animals like cows. They taught me how to be on the earth and in the earth. When you have 2 generations, my parents and my grandparents and my grandmother, when you have that in your life while you're growing, then you know you can ask any question you want. You know you can make observations that might be crazy. It's all right. So I would say the freedom of the farm in all seasons was a freedom that was liberating my imagination. When I was a sophomore in high school or so, I began to be very focused on the question of what was I going to do with my life that had meaning and purpose. And I remember thinking of a counter fantasy. I said, suppose your job was being a perfume salesman. What would you be doing with your talents and abilities? And that was for me the ultimate horror of a bad choice for my life. My memory was I wanted to do something generous with my life, something that made a difference. And that it had turned out that because my dad loved the Jesuits when he went to college, I said, well, let's try the Jesuits. So that's why I entered.
Why did you stay?
That's a very good question. That's a much more interesting question than why did you enter. I had 5 years of, I was very smart, I was working hard intellectually, and I was glad I did that. But I was full of tension. I would wake up in the morning and ask myself, why do I get out of bed? What's the purpose of anything? So I had kind of nihilistic anxieties till 1964. In 1964, out of a clear blue sky, my provincial assigned me to do what we call Regency, 3 years of teaching, at an Indian reservation school in Pine Ridge, South Dakota. I was proud to be sent, but I didn't know anything about teaching, anything about it. I did not know anything about Native Americans, God save us. I was still in that little bubble where there was only one non-Caucasian. That's the world I had grown up in. So what am I going to do learning how to teach? So that shock is, I would call that a shock that has gone on the rest of my life. And it is that along with the real spiritual exercises with the director are the 2 reasons I'm a Jesuit. I was wrestling with, do I understand anything at all about my capacity for intimacy and anything at all about whether I can find purpose in my life. What happened when I got to the reservation is a world so completely different than anything I had ever imagined that it blew those questions kind of through the wall. I mean, there were so many more important things to see, to learn. That was my beginning of learning a world in which, in my first year of teaching, 33% of the high school students dropped out of school that year. The suicide rate was 10 times the national average. It took a long time for me to understand just how different that was from Marinette, Wisconsin, where I grew up. It was heartbreaking. The magnitude of the suffering made all of my self-doubts, they're gone. They were irrelevant. So the fact that I fell in love with the people of Pine Ridge over time transformed my idea of saying, I don't know if I can love people. Who cares? When you see a high school boy who comes back, was going to come back to school over the weekend, he's been at home, and you learn at 5 in the afternoon, at that Sunday afternoon, that he's in jail because he cut someone's head open with an axe. And I can still remember that. I can still remember the feeling of it. Oh my God. I knew that kid. I knew his family. Oh my God. Well, how many times? It didn't take long to figure out that that's not unusual and that I'd better become intimate with that level of suffering or I'm not here. It is, I suppose, an accident of history that at the same time that I was beginning to understand the magnitude of the difference between the culture I grew up in and the culture I was trying to live in, that the Second Vatican Council was going on in Rome, and that there were forces, theological forces, that were beginning to liberate me from a very constricted view of Catholicism in the period leading up to the Second Vatican Council. So it was very exciting for a young adult. And I made my first directed retreat between my first year of teaching and my second year of teaching. I made the retreat in Denver, and I had a director who had been the same Jesuit who had helped me through my despair and anguish. I trusted him completely. So we sort of did our best to figure out how to make the spiritual exercises in 1965. And I found out one of the few things I remember well about what I learned then is that place matters. So I was there for 8 days, and you can see the Rocky Mountains from the 4th floor of the Jesuit residence there. And I used to, after one day, I figured out that in the dining room they had windows with deep, nice deep
windowsills?
Yeah, windowsills. So I would sit over there, pull a chair over there, and I'd put a cup of coffee down on that place, and I could see the Rocky Mountains out the window. And that's where I learned that you can find a place, physical place, that helps you pray. And when I go there now, I'm on their board. I've been there for a long time. That's now an office, but I sometimes go back to that window and just remember, this is where I learned that I could pray. In my second year of teaching, I of course knew things better. People trusted me. So what happened? So I said, I can do this. First year, I didn't know anything about what I could do. By the second year, I said, I haven't figured all this stuff out. I don't know why some things I try work and others don't, but the fact is, I know I can do this. And I love being there, and that's why I still come out there. But in the middle of that, towards maybe year 3, it's a little hard to remember, somewhere in there, a very big question began to emerge for me. I had just come from a very demanding master's program in European philosophy. Had great teachers. And now I was beginning to be befriended by students who would tell me stories from a world so different than the Western world that at first I just said, what? So the kid that came back from a weekend break and told me that he and his buddy had gone to an all-night UEP service. That's a medicine man. Well, they don't say that word. The holy man conducts a service with the 4 sacred directions, blah, blah, blah. And it's in the basement, and so he puts the sacred square up. And when he draws the square on the dirt floor of the basement, he tells everybody, don't go inside the square. So, says my buddy, my student, my friend said, I wonder what will happen if I, typical adolescent. So he stuck his foot across that into the square. And I said, so what happened? He said, now remember, I am coming from Western epistemology with its inherent bias that no other epistemology is anything other than an object of study. So he says to me, well, when he put his foot across the line, his foot disappeared. And I'm just keeping cool, but my mind is reeling. His foot disappeared. These are ordinary kids. The foot disappeared. How can that be? So I said, and then what? He said, well, he pulled it back and didn't do that anymore. Now that was, I can still remember, that was Tyrone Apple telling me this story from the weekend. Did he know that he was shocking me? Because I was still so immersed in just one epistemology. I don't know. He might have just been telling me a story from the weekend. But I began to say, now wait a minute. I have to face something. This is an utterly un-Western religious and cognitive world. And I am schooled in a Western cognitive world, one of its tenets being non-Western thinking is not legitimate thinking. It is only to be studied anthropologically. That was embedded in me for years of study. Are the Lakota people my peers or an object of my generosity? That is an extremely important question in my life. And it took a while, because if I say they are my peers, I am shattering the hold of an absolute Western mind mentality. And I love Western epistemology. I mean, I'm good at it. And it was little by little, and it was because the more embedded I got in the neighborhood, the more the grandmothers began to befriend me, and the more the sufferings of very poor and brutalized people became more intimate for me. I began to say, what's wrong with having several epistemologies? Now that's a pretty revolutionary thought for someone schooled in Western epistemology. So that was probably intellectually the most important conversion process I made for the rest of my intellectual life.